Hello everyone, welcome to this video that I'm going to do on the Google Staff Software Engineer interview experience. So I recently interviewed with Google for a Staff Software Engineer position, that's an L6 position, and I decided to do this video just to give you a walkthrough of how it went and tips for you to succeed. There's a lot of material out there for lower level Google interviews like L3, L4, but staff level L6 there isn't as much material, so I thought I'll make this video to give you the rundown and really give you some tips and break it down on what you can do to make it successful. So let's get right into it. So I will start with an introduction of myself, who I am, what domain, how many years of experience I have, and then how I prepared. And then I'll give you a rundown of each round I went through in an interview, and then some of the things I tried not to do. And yeah, just keep in mind, I will not mention some of the things in the slides, so just listen up and pay attention, take some notes, and yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy this video. And so, just a brief introduction of myself. I am a senior software engineer at Amazon. I've been senior for around 2.5 years. I have a total of around 8 years of experience. My primary skills throughout my career that I've worked with are more of backend architecture, backend development, Java, managing like data pipeline streaming architectures and building like highly scalable APIs. I actually worked on Prime Video as well, which is a global worldwide service. And my domain has primarily been, streaming. I've worked with Prime Video, I've worked with Amazon Music, I've done some ad insertion. So yeah, primarily my domain expertise is around streaming and ad insertion. And yes, recently I applied for a staff software engineer position at Google. And in this video, I'll give you the rundown. So how I prepared, what did I do to prepare? And usually the staff software engineer has three parts to the interview, right? They have a coding rounds, they have some design rounds, and they have a behavioral or googliness round. So for the coding round, what I did is, you know, standard stuff, lead code questions. I tried to make sure I covered the breadth of the different topics like dynamic programming, binary search, just BFS, DFS, two pointer based solutions, solutions that involve a 2D grid, and just like keeping myself warm on navigating arrays, linked list, like priority queues, just really just keeping that tool set warm and knowing how to solve these questions. And here again, don't over index on solving like extremely hard and trivia style of questions. Just like lead code medium and some of the hards that are not too hard. I think that's a good range to be in. But mostly what you're looking for is just training your muscle on looking at the problem and coming up with the solution. And over here, don't try to, like, the way I recommend really that how the learning sticks is really try to solve the question yourself. Like, try not to look at the solution and then learn that way. Spend a lot of time trying to solve it yourself and struggling with it, because then when you look at the solution after that, you will really appreciate it. It'll really stick, and you can do it next time when you see a similar problem. So yeah, that's what I recommend. And the lead code has questions tagged with by company, so you can find Google questions. Even on YouTube there are videos that show you which questions belong to Google, and they also have featured lists, so you can find the top interview question lists and go off that. So yeah, just keep yourself warm. Nothing too crazy. I did it around, I'd say around 50 to 80 questions, nothing more than that. So the next type of interview is system design, and for this one, it's really people are usually nervous about this, but the way I try to prepare is I watch YouTube videos on system design interviews and system designs. Right, there's a lot of content out there, and some of them they break down what you're supposed to do step by step, like understand the problem, clarify the requirements and the scope, break it down into functional and non-functional requirements, and then design your high level and low level solutions and so on. And I'll talk a bit about that in the later part of the rundown, but basically, just there's a lot of content on YouTube on system design interviews. Watch them. But really, what I found super useful is these books by Alex Su. So he has two books called System Design Interview, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And both of these books have I think he breaks down about like 10 questions in each book by chapter. And if you read these, you'll I think this is all you need to know. If you understand these questions well and know how to design these systems and the trade-offs, every interview question you'll get will pretty much fall under one of those type of questions, right? There are some common patterns which, again, I'll also go more into when I go through the rundown of my design interviews. So yeah, I think read these books. These are amazing books, and also supplement that with YouTube videos. And then another tip I'd say here is like don't try to believe everything you see or you watch, right? Like have your own insights, your own opinions, and really try to seek out like how you would design things, because some of the content is biased. Like some people have worked a lot with, like, let's say it's technology specific to Facebook or Amazon, and their designs are kind of um, tailored to those technologies, which may not be more generally applicable. So just look at it from that lens. But yeah, in general, like watching YouTube videos and reading system design interview book is really useful. So the next part is the behavioral or leadership. And the way I prepared for that is I wrote down my accomplishments and major projects that I worked on, and just like, different, and they don't need to be full-fledged projects, right? Like even like small, like making a decision in your organization or helping someone get promoted, right? So these are like small accomplishments that matter when you're at the leadership position. So think about how you mentored people, how you made accelerated decision making in your organization, how you delivered projects, and maybe how you um, made a business critical impact or decision or implementation for your organization quickly, right? So write these accomplishments down, and I try to write them down in like a situation action result format. So in the situation, try to emphasize on the challenges, the complexity, and like lay out what your role was in the organization before you explain the situation, the challenges, the complexity, and then how you kind of navigated and derived actions and results from it. And then Google is big on the way they treat their people and customers and inclusion and conflict resolution. So make sure you are prepared for stories that are around inclusion, right? Like how you made someone fit in. Conflict resolution, like, if you have different design approaches, if you don't agree on a solution, or there's conflicting roadmaps between teams, like how do you resolve that, and without like, strong arming people and without exercising authority. So I think these are some key attributes of leadership that you should be prepared to talk about. And then, yeah, so then now let me just give you a rundown of like setting up the actual interview. So they had me skip the phone screen because I already um, work at one of these FANG companies, so I didn't do a phone screen. But I imagine if you did the phone screen, it will be similar to one of the coding or design interviews, which I'll talk about later. So don't be too worried about that I don't have phone screen experience for this video. Um, and then I requested for my on-site, which is actually a virtual on-site, because after COVID, everyone worked from home. So now all interviews are virtual. And so I requested for it to be split on 2 days, right? So the first day in the afternoon, I did, I didn't pick the split, but this was the split. Like on the first day, they had 2 coding rounds and 1 system design round. And then on the second day, they had 1 system design round and 1 behavioral round. And I think that gave me some time to kind of, be mentally well prepared. Doing 5 rounds in 1 day could be overwhelming. So it's something I recommend doing if you have that option to split it into 2 days. And so now let's get into the actual interview. So the first coding interview it was just a graph or dynamic programming problem with a 2D grid. And unlike the conventional questions where you're usually asked for shortest path, this time I was asked for longest path, which brought upon some interesting cases, right? Like even when you reach your destination, or the like the part of the problem was that you need to reach to the bottom row, right? But then even if you reach the bottom row, you could go left or right, and increase your path. So because it's longest path, you need to consider these additional possibilities that are not typically there. And my takeaways from this interview were like, the problems in Google can have twists, and they might not just be like copy paste lead code questions, obviously, right? And so really take some time to think about the edge cases and different scenarios, and draw it out as an example to visualize it, because you know in the virtual interview it's very hard. Like, you don't have a whiteboard in front of you, and if this was an actual on-site interview, you would just draw it on the whiteboard and be able to visualize it. But the opportunity to do that kind of becomes harder when you're virtual, because you're just on a screen, and you're just on a shared like doc, and so you might tend to skip drawing it because it's just like it takes a bit more time consuming probably than just like scratching it up on the whiteboard. But this will be worth it, because sometimes you can't see these edge cases, like, if you don't actually draw it out or visualize it, right? So like, do that, and then talk about your approach, because even if, like, my approach, for example, was like I'd have another array which stores, I create a definition that this array would store the longest path from any node ij to the bottom, and then I'll try to populate this array. And so just, even if I had some bugs, for example, in populating the array, but just giving that rundown of how I think about it and break the problem gives the interviewer more data points that, okay, you can actually structured approach a problem step by step, and even your approach is correct, but even if you have some bugs in your implementation, they'll have confidence that, okay, given enough time, you'll be able to fix them, right? So um, really talk about your approach, what's going on in your head, how you're actually like breaking down this problem and thinking about it step by step. And don't get overwhelmed, like, even if the answer is not clear to you in one go, but if you talk about your approach and approach it systematically, maybe halfway, it's like rubber duck debugging, right? So maybe halfway through talking through it, then you'll be able to see the answer more clearly. So that's kind of what I did in this interview as well. Like, the answer was not immediately clear to me as soon as he put the question out there, but then I walked him through a systematic approach, and then the answer became clear to me as well. So yeah, these are some of the takeaways I have from the first coding interview. And then the second coding interview, it was just a standard topological sort problem. So, like, you have to like tasks. You have to perform a set of tasks. Tasks depend on other tasks, and return an order that you can perform these tasks in is an example of this type of problem. And so this was a more standard problem, but you might think that, okay, could this be too easy? So the things that I realized that you should focus on here are, like, consider, like, this is a senior engineering position, right? You're not just evaluated on how you're coding, but some of the decisions you make about your code and their maintainability, right? Like, what do you do in error scenarios? Do you throw an exception? Why do you throw an exception? Why not like return an optional? What are the pros and cons of doing that? And talk about alternative solutions, right? Like, this topological sort problem has two ways of doing it. You could do it using DFS, which is what I did, or the BFS, which has the in degree and all that. And so, talk about, this can be at the start or at the end, but once you do it, talk about different other ways you can approach it, because as a senior or staff engineer, you're expected to evaluate alternatives and make the right decisions, right? So talk about alternative implementations, and then definitely ask clarifying questions on the like validity of the input. This problem has a lot of opportunity for like cycles and invalid input, and like semantically incorrect input, like depending on tasks that don't exist and things like that. So just ask clarifying questions on what's possible, what's not, and surely you can implement it. But I think the more important thing that the interviewer wants to know here is whether you're actually clarifying and understanding what actually needs to be done, more than if you do it correctly. For specifically this third bullet point, right? Like, everyone can write good validation logic, but the important thing is, do you actually have a framework to figure out what you should do? And yeah, for this problem, they didn't give me like a function signature and told me to implement the function, right? Like you have to come up with that. So this is just a tip I have, like, make sure you understand your inputs and outputs before you actually go into coding and the approach. So when they lay out the problem statement, like try to get to the input and output first. That's like your interface, right? So that you know what you're working with. So these are some of my takeaways from the second coding interview. And overall, these questions aren't hard, but they're just looking really for your approach, the fact that you can code basic algorithms, and how you make decisions about your code. That's really what they're looking for, I think. And yeah, so next is my design interview. So after the two coding interviews, I had two design interviews. And the first one was designing a streaming service. The second one was designing a reservation or a booking service. And again, both of these questions were present in that book. So it's not exactly the same, but if you understand, if you've read those books and you understand the different moving parts, then at least you can provide a very good performance in the interview because you know the different parts and you can dive into ones based on what the interviewer wants. And so some of my takeaways here are like talk about all functional aspects of the problem, right? Like demonstrate your breadth of understanding. So like for example, when I was asked to design a streaming service, the streaming service has like a lot of different parts, like ingesting the media, searching, playing the media, personalized recommendations. You have ad insertions. You have lead royalties because you want to pay back the people who made the content. There's like yeah, personalization, like customized watch lists that customers could create. So there's a lot of different parts that this streaming service can have, and like talk about all those. Hey, like when I think of a streaming service, here are all the things that come to my mind, and is there are there areas that you would like me to focus on? So then that allows you to demonstrate your breadth, but then also, you know, scope it down to what you can reasonably complete in the interviewer, and then the interviewer will tell you where they'd like you to dive in. So, in this case, it was like, okay, dive into search and playback, for example, and then keep an open mind to consider alternatives because sometimes you may have some designs in mind and you may have worked with a certain technology a lot, and you might just say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it, but then the interviewer might give you some hints or probe, like, okay, what are the trade-offs, are there other ways to do this, and just keep an open mind, right? Like don't have a closed mind that this is the only way to do it, because by keeping an open mind you can more easily grab their hints and then figure out, like, okay, here's another way that could happen, weigh the pros and cons, and then pick one that's most reasonable for the problem at hand. Because sometimes you might have solutions that were made under different constraints which might not exist in this specific interview problem, and then if those constraints go away, there's a simpler solution, right? So yeah, keep an open mind there. I think an example of this is in the reservation service. They had this concept of like blocking some slots for a specific period of time, and then once the time expires, those slots get freed up, right? So you could either do the expiration in the asynchronously in the background, but then another option is that you could do it at runtime, at query time, filter those out, right? So I've worked a lot with the first kind of option, and then when I got some hints from the interviewer, that came to mind. Oh, we could also do it this way, and so yeah, just keep an open mind, and then explain your reasoning and pros and cons, because even sometimes while you're thinking about the problem, you make some decisions. Okay, I could do this or do this, but I'm going to do this because. So just explain that thought process. Don't just say, okay, I'm going to do this, right? Explain, okay, here I'm thinking that I could do X and Y, and because of ABC, I'm going to pick X, right? Or you can say, okay, here I'm thinking we have two options. We could do X or Y. I don't know yet which one I'm going to pick, and I'll just run with it until I figure it out. And then later, when you get to a point where you understand it more, then you can go back and say, okay, now because of this, I'll pick X or I'll pick Y. So don't be afraid to kind of walk through your process really, and like you don't have to give an answer. Your goal is to explain your reasoning and then how you approach and eventually come up with the answer, right? And then obviously read up on common patterns and questions. This is the same thing I mentioned earlier. Like these books contain some very common pattern questions, and once you understand these, I think you'll be good at any system design interview at any company. Like, there's like the top K question where you have to efficiently return the top 10 most searched items or whatever, right? Top 10 most viewed videos. And this is an interesting problem, involves some data aggregation, some caching. So there's all these different patterns that you can get from it that you can apply to the top K type of questions and even other questions. And these are some of the other common questions, like designing a distributed rate limiter, distributed cache, like designing a news feed where you have you follow people, they publish something, and then there's the case of celebrities where it could put the system under a lot of load. So how do you deal with that? And just knowing those patterns will help you develop these tools in your system design toolkit. And some of the other examples, like distributed file system, a view count system, a web crawler, ad event aggregation. Ad event aggregation is a really nice problem, because not just because it's related to ads, but then it gives you like a whole view of asynchronous and streaming systems, right? Like offline aggregation, map reduce, bringing it together. And I think this question is in one of those books, and it gives a very good detailed rundown of different parts of the system. Another one is proximity service, like just the concept of geohashing and how you would index a geographical space in a database. And this is another very useful tool that can be applied in lots of different problems, like Uber, Google Maps, nearby friends, like designing give me the 5 nearest bus stops and things like that. And then obviously online booking, like hotel booking, venue booking, that's reservation service. That's the one I got in Google as well. And then some of the other type of questions, like designing a tiny URL shortening service, ID generator, or web crawler. So I think there are like some of these very common questions, and if you know how to navigate these and make decisions, like why the system is designed in this way, then I think you'll be well equipped to answer any sort of design interview. And obviously, don't discard any of the tips that you read elsewhere, right? I haven't covered everything here, so like just really asking clarifying questions, laying out functional and non-functional requirements, and all that. All those still apply to your design interviews. So the final one is the leadership and the googliness interview. And what I learned here is that their focus is really on inclusion, conflict resolution, making right decisions without strong arming people, or not, making right decisions, without being like, trying to be like a people pleaser, right? So like you just make decisions for the sake of making everyone happy, and without making the right decision. So it's important to both make the right decisions and also in an empathetic way, so that you don't, make people feel left out or make them feel like stupid. So the type of questions that I got were like, how you help someone fit in, like, how did you recognize that situation, how did you address that situation, just like talking to them one on one, making a safe space for them to express their thoughts. Other type of question is like, there's a decision that management says, okay, go do this, but then you knew that it's not, or it might not be the best decision, so you didn't make it just because the management told you to. You actually did an evaluation, and how you navigated that, how you surfaced the data back to the management, like whether you found out what they were really concerned about and provided an alternative. So you just don't say like, we won't do it, but you provide like, okay, here's what we actually want to solve, and here's a way to solve it, right? So sometimes a decision comes just from top down, but then how do you, if it's not the right decision, how do you handle that situation, right? And then other ones is just around conflict resolution, right? Like you have code and design reviews, and you're maybe in a disagreement. How do you avoid heated debates? How do you work with them one-on-one and then present solutions as a team, rather than kind of like me versus you attitude? So yeah, just how you handle those situations from an empathetic lens. And then, how do you navigate like when you realize your users are not included, right? Like what would you do if you have a product that, oh, this LGBT community might feel bad about that. So like, some of these topics around inclusion. So, Google is very particular about that. So, you would not want to launch something which excludes, some kind of diverse DEI type of groups. And, but if it's more of like, okay, we can launch in US, but we can't launch in Europe because in Europe there are some additional regulations or features which we need, that's a kind of a different story. Then you can go ahead and launch the product for a subset of users. But then, if it's like, oh, this product will hurt the feelings or make, like LGBT people feel left out, then you probably don't want to launch that product and fix it before you launch it, right? And then at the same time, like, how do you make sure that, development doesn't get blocked, right? So you continue making progress, at the same time make the right decisions. And so, yeah, like a lot of this is just, conflict resolution, working with people empathetically, working as a team, and, just avoiding conflicts in the workplace. And obviously inclusion, right? Like making people feel included. And so some of the takeaways that I have from this interview are like, be concise yet complete. So you don't want to kind of just give a rant. Make sure your answer has a very structured framework. Like you start by, clarifying your role, explaining the situation, and then the actions and the results. If the focus is on the complexity and the actions, spend more time there, and keep it very concise. Like make sure you don't miss out the data points, but then make sure you give the shortest possible story that delivered the data points. So don't try to like ramble about, how, like for example, if there was a if you say, okay, there was a problem with our audio quality, you don't need to go and ramble about how you found that problem if that's not the focus, right? Just say, okay, there was a problem. I can go into how we identified that, but I'll skip that for the sake of this, for the sake of this answer, and then just move on, right? And then if the interviewer wants you to focus on it, they'll ask you. But yeah, try to be as concise as possible and complete so that you can give the most data points in a short amount of time. And then, yeah, really focus on making both business, customers, and people happy. And, so make sure that you aren't compromising customer satisfaction and the growth of the business. But at the same time, you also are not compromising, how people feel, the team working well together, and, avoiding conflicts within the team. So you can't say, okay, because I want to avoid conflict, I just won't do this for our customers or for the business. That's not something, that's the easy way out, right? So focus on demonstrating how you can achieve both. And then as you do this, focus also on frameworks or mental models, right? Like on the senior level, you want to be able to demonstrate that you can't just, it's not just the situation at hand you can handle, but you can handle all the family of similar situations. And the way you demonstrate that is use frameworks or mental models, right? Like, for example, if an example is like, for example, if you're guiding a junior engineer to take on a more leadership role in a project, right? How do you go about that, right? So like, you can say, okay, I implanted a mental model onto him that I should, or he should try and focus on, since he's playing a more lead role, his time is limited, so he should try and focusing on converting unknown unknowns to known unknowns, and when they are known unknowns, you delegate them to someone else and then let them solve that problem, and then you move on to identifying more unknown unknowns, right? So that demonstrates that, okay, you have a framework on how you execute, right? Like you actually are thinking about this in this framework, and that's how you're driving your actions, right? And so really demonstrate that you're operating under a framework, and you're not just like saying actions that you did specific to that situation. It's like, oh, I asked him to look into ad insertion while I looked at like this proof of concept on prefetching. That's different from saying, okay, I was operating under a framework where I wanted to focus on unknown unknowns and then delegate the known unknowns. And so since this XYZ thing was an unknown unknown, this prefetching, that's where I focused on, and then I delegated the ad insertion, for example. So just just demonstrate that your actions are guided by frameworks, and that will really give you, demonstrate your leadership. And then obviously show imperfect success. Like not everything is shining and bright and perfect. So make sure that with every story you're even proactive in saying, okay, here are the results, and then here's what I actually learned from this, and here's what something I could have done better. And then even raising the bar even more is like, okay, here, and then another situation where I applied this and is XYZ's, and then but don't like give a whole novel on that situation. Just make it very brief. The idea is just to demonstrate that you're taking learnings and you're making an effort to apply them, and you actually have applied them somewhere. So like you can say, okay, from this story I learned that I should delegate more tasks if they're ambiguous, and grow other people. And actually when in the next project when that I was dealing with related to ad insertion, when someone approached me and asked me to do this, I actually took the time to think and delegated to one of my junior engineers who actually benefited from that project and got promoted, right? So something like that where it's very brief, but you send the message that you took the learning, you applied it, and then you actually applied it, yeah, in another example. So yeah, those are kind of some of the takeaways for the googliness interview. And so I also want to wrap this up by telling some of the things I tried not to do. So one is like don't over prepare, right? Like I had people telling me, okay, you should prepare for 3 months, 5 months because it's Google. You need to make sure you don't bomb it. The truth is it doesn't help, right? Like imagine if you're given a coding question and you missed like one edge case. Even if you prepared 2 or 3 months, you might still have missed that. Like the you don't actually get substantially more by over preparing. Like I only took 3 weeks to prepare, right? I didn't take even a month. Like I took only 3 weeks, but I made sure I knew I had a framework under which I was preparing, right? Like I had to do this for coding, this for design, this for behavioral, and just go ahead and do that, and then go to the interview. And obviously, take other interviews, right? Like don't just go into this interview. Take other interviews as well. Try to schedule other interviews so you get the practice and the muscle. But yeah, just definitely don't over-index on preparing. Like don't take 3-4 months to prepare. That won't actually add value, right? Like keep it short. Don't stress yourself out, and stress is gonna be your enemy, right? So if you prepare for 5 months, be super stressed, super invested in it, and then that'll actually like negatively impact your performance. So yeah, figure out what's best for you. Maybe for you 5 weeks or 6 weeks is better, and not 3 weeks. But the point is just don't try to over prepare, right? Like allocate as little time as possible. Don't worry about oh, what if I get a question I can't answer, because that can always happen. So over preparing is not going to help. And then don't be nervous, right? Like if you're going for a staff position, you've been a senior engineer, you have experience, you've built systems, you've managed teams, or you've led teams. So that experience is valuable, and just have confidence in bringing to the table what you have. And don't try to be nervous, right? Like just treat it as a conversation, treat it as a problem solving exercise, just have fun. I think that will give you the best chance of succeeding. And it's easy to say don't be nervous. Obviously there's a bit of nerves everywhere, but just try to offset it by thinking that you have confidence in your ability, that you can that you can demonstrate your skills, and you can solve the problem at hand. And the third one is just don't try to make fake stories, right? Like be real. you, Whatever experience you have is valuable, and if they don't think it's valuable, someone else will think it's valuable, and that might be better for you. So just don't try to make fake stories. Be real, but then also at the same time don't underestimate your experience, right? Like really dig in. And this is more for the behavioral questions, right? Like really dig into your experience and see what you have to offer, right? Like what actually, like some of the things that you might find might be overwhelming, right? Like maybe you help resolve a conflict and you don't think it's a big deal, but actually it is, right? Like maybe you made a decision that was critical and you navigate it. So really look hard at your experience and extract those stories, because there's a lot of stories there. And one of the things that you could do proactively is try to keep this as a running document throughout your career, right? Like as things are happening, just put them down. But yeah, really look hard at your career, and there's a lot of stories. So you know, bring that out, and then that will make you unique and it will make you stand out. And then don't, yeah, like don't overlook preparation for behavioral questions, right? Like I didn't spend a lot of time on coding, I spent more time on design and behavioral questions, because for coding, again, like over preparing doesn't actually help. Make sure you cover the breadth of the topics, but, and you know, you can solve a reasonable amount of questions, but don't over index on like trying a really good question just in case you get it. Like it's not actually going to help. um, because you know, you can always get a question that you don't know and then you'll miss it, so it's not going to help that much to over prepare on coding. But for design and behavioral, that's what actually matters most for staff or a senior engineer, right? Like especially behavioral leadership questions. um, you have a you'll have a position of authority, and they want to make sure you're not like, you know, you won't make people feel bad and screw up the team, right? So really make sure that you're preparing on behavioral questions and having concise and dense stories that give a lot of data. You know, it's harder than you think, so like prepare for those and make sure, work on making it concise and delivering really all the data that you have to offer. So yeah, don't overlook that. And yeah, I think that's all I had to offer. Thank you for listening to this, and you know, subscribe, and obviously let's have a discussion in the comments. If you want to, if you have questions, if you want to talk about anything, put them in the comments. Subscribe to my channel if you like the content. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Cheers.